Shane Mahoney, your guest speaker for tonight. Thank you very much.
Well, I am delighted to be here, first of all, and also delighted to know that being a Newfoundlander would not be held against me. We have a long and tortured history, of course, as you know, having only joined Canada in 1949, and so we're sort of still feeling our way, so to speak, and how that all works out. I have given my entire life to the conservation of nature. And I will give what's left of it to the conservation of nature as well. And I am 100% certain that the main reason why that has become the vocation of my life is because of the place where I was born and raised and educated, not only in terms of schooling, but educated in the ways of how resource extraction works and the impacts it has, both positive and negative, upon the people who live closest to the resource. My career has taken me to many different parts of the world, and I now work substantively in the international arena, and I serve as Vice Global Chair for Sustainable Use for the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, which is, I think, indisputably the most powerful organization of its kind in the world. You'll note that my particular role is Vice Chair of Sustainable Use and Livelihoods. So I'd like to make it very, very clear to everyone in this room that my concerns extend to the wild others we share this planet with, but they also extend with equal measure, equal concern, equal passion to the people of the world. I have watched the dichotomy between those two perspectives become strangely difficult and tension-filled, as though to enter the world of conservation, one had to make a decision about whether one was for people or was for the wild others, for wildlife. And that made absolutely no sense to me, because I came from a culture where the people and the wild creatures and the other natural resources of the land were so closely entwined that I never really saw much difference between working for one and working for the other. That beautiful understanding of the relationship between humans and the natural world that was afforded a young boy living in an absolutely idyllic natural environment, in an absolutely idyllic social milieu, was offset by numerous things later in life, where the imbalances in the approach to conservation of natural resources led to circumstances such as the collapse of the northern cod, which had absolutely devastating impact upon the people I belong to, and which taught us that no matter how long you can be in the game, no matter how good you are at the game of resource extraction, no matter what institutions you may try to put in place, great calamities, great difficulties which impinge upon the homes and the lives and the happiness of good people can happen. We We live in a very difficult world, ladies and gentlemen, and for those of you who have the opportunity to travel a lot internationally, I'm sure you will agree with me when I say that most of us living in Canada and most of us who live in the United States of America are living a dream. The circumstances that prevail in so many parts of the world, major parts of Asia, the former Soviet Union, in Africa, are circumstances that most of you in this room would have very grave difficulty relating to. And if you thought that it was the future for you or your families or your children or your grandchildren, you would be struggling mightily to figure out a way to avoid that at all costs. We are in a world facing an extreme loss of biodiversity. I know sometimes the reports that come to us through the media leave some people feeling that, oh, do we have to hear it again? But I'm afraid the facts do not go away because they are repeated. The truth of the matter is we are losing biodiversity at a tremendous pace. The truth is that climate change is making a big difference. The truth is that the growth in human population is forcing us to a level and scale and pace of natural resource extraction which simply cannot be maintained. There may be regional exceptions to this, but to speak globally, that is certainly an unalterable, if inconvenient, truth. The cumulative impacts of these kinds of major themes, climate change, etc., biodiversity loss, are extraordinarily challenging. And the challenges don't fall to a sector in society. The challenges are not government's challenges. The challenges are not industry's challenges. The challenges are not the public's challenges. The challenges are our challenges. And now, facing many of the businesses and industries that might be situated in this room this evening, and I'm absolutely delighted to have the chance to speak to the business communities. There is also an incredibly powerful change taking place in human attitudes around the world. They're not fiction. They're not induced by some group of malevolent individuals who believe in a particular philosophy, animal rights, or protectionism. You can give them the labels they want. Unfortunately, that's not what's happening. What is happening is there is a change taking place in societies the world over that reflect increased empathy for wildlife and animals generally, increased concerns for the planet's natural systems, for fresh water, for God's sake. And I'm not talking fresh water in the India-Pakistan border or parts of Saharan Africa. I'm talking about concerns over water in the United States and Canada. And there's growing skepticism of politics, of political leadership, and of industry. And none of these trends are going away. You sit here in this extraordinary place, now known as British Columbia, long inhabited for thousands of years by a great diversity of First Nations, their own diversity reflecting the extraordinary diversity of the landscapes and resources that were available in this part of the world. And you still have tremendous biological diversity in this part of Canada, perhaps the greatest of all. And you have, right now, perhaps the healthiest economy in all of Canada, and certainly one of the most diverse, if not the most diverse. So I would say, on balance, the citizens of British Columbia are doing pretty well indeed. This complex economy made up of forestry and mining, agriculture and seafood, the energy sectors, oil and gas, wildlife-related issues, all of these things give you and bring you an inevitable amount of discussion and dialogue about the issues of balance. Now, I come from a culture, my mother was Irish, my father a Newfoundlander, so as you probably know, I'm probably not the best one to talk to you about balance. Frenzy, yes. Balance, no. But I have to try because I'm the keynote speaker. Getting the balance right for protecting the environment, developing economies, and extracting resources is simply extremely difficult. It is never easy. But I think there are some things that we might agree we can share in our belief system of why it is possible and what the things are that we should pay attention to as we try and achieve it. Because there is an irreducible truth that we cannot either leave aside the natural resources of this planet and leave them undeveloped, but we can neither extract them at a pace or in a manner that damages the fundamental, integral systems of nature in such a way that we will all, businesses and individuals, suffer greatly. We have to make this choice. You have to make this choice. This is not a game of accidents. This is a game of purpose. This is a game of determination. This is a game of metrics, of scale, of flowcharts, of budgets, of investment, of output. It's not some scramble. I think the very first thing we might agree on in trying to find this kind of better way would be to agree that we need a true evaluation of all resources. And I don't just mean true evaluation of some of the resources that haven't been evaluated before, such as wildlife perhaps. I mean a true valuation of all resources. Forests have tremendous value for the wood they provide. There is no question. They also have tremendous value for the effect they have on natural systems, water regulation, clean air, carbon sequestration. I don't think that we have found a way yet to perfectly measure all of those values and how we disperse those values through the industries that are responsible for the development and management of those stocks. We know that many of the resources we have never fully evaluated. It's a really interesting thing to think about wildlife in this regard. And I won't bore you with constant references to wildlife, even though that is my passion and love, because I deal with all resources in my role for sustainable use. But I will tell you that because we have so long automatically been engaged in the harvesting of wildlife to some extent, we tend to forget the extraordinary value of that food in terms of food security and in terms of the health of people. In other words, we can do a better job of evaluating almost every natural resource we have, from the minerals that are there to the fishes that spawn in such great numbers in these waters of this region of the world, to the wildlife that exists on the forests and dry lands of British Columbia. I think we also can agree that we ought to recognize that this is a shared responsibility. One of the most aggravating things for all of us, interestingly enough, is the way one sector or another can decide that the other sectors have got it all wrong, and they have got it right. Now, that sector might be the public that thinks they have it right, and industry has it wrong. It might be industry thinking they're having it right, and the public has it wrong. And of course, one can only be empathetic for those in political office, because usually both groups think they have it wrong. I have been involved in such debates for decades, and I cannot recall a single such debate where in the end we could determine that just some entity, some angle, some person, some cohort were the ones who had it wrong. Seems inevitably there was enough to go around. Recognizing that shared responsibility, however, also means that we have to think about the world that we want to build. A richer world is a better world in many ways. And if you approach people who are disadvantaged around the world, they will certainly tell you that what they want most is a better standard of living. They want more money. They want more commodities. They want better schools. They want better clothing. They want better education. They want better health care. It all takes money. It doesn't come out of the sky. But it is not always about richer. There are many things in life that are highly valued, that relate to peace, that relate to civility, that relate to progress, that are not ultimately tethered to wealth or its creation. I think one of the most important things that could happen in our debate about how we strike a balance between resource development and environmental protection is to come to agreement on the big issues and then simply agree to disagree on the small ones, because we generally agree on the bigger issues. We generally agree that to denude entire sections of land and do it in such a way that it prevents regeneration, for example, of forests, would not be an acceptable thing to do. We may disagree, however, about a certain specific way in which we harvest and what kind of cereal stages of forest we want afterwards. We might well agree that we do not want mining tailings stored in a way that allows them to leach into groundwater or into aquifers, but we might have much smaller disagreements on exactly how impoundments should be built or how other aspects of a mining operation should be conducted. We've got to remember, too, that diplomacy in these issues is not about raw power. And neither is progress about raw power. I am a firm believer in the capacity of human beings to innovate. We've been doing it for so long, it's in our blood, it's in our genes, if you will. And the end result is that so many of us cannot avoid a good problem. We have to try and solve it. We ought to realize that there is abundant evidence to show that we take people of different perspectives and force them to come together to try and solve a problem. Extraordinarily innovative approaches emerge that never come to the fore when people are working in silos. One can draw analogies from nature of cross-fertilization. One can come to any kind of modeling sense one wants, but the bottom line is that antagonism to an extent generates innovation. If the first human hadn't been antagonized by boils on his feet, he might never have invented the wheel. Antagonism helps us. I look at the kinds of joint ventures that have taken place in antagonism that relate directly to businesses in this room. The Endangered Species Act in both Canada and the United States. Highly important, highly controversial pieces of legislation in both countries. Very similar in their design, very similar in their impact, and very similar in their trajectories now. So we are seeing a pattern arise in the United States of America where attempts are made by groups coming together to prevent listings on the Endangered Species Act by developing better models cooperatively to protect the long-term sustainability of those potentially endangered life forms, and doing it to such an extent that the management body, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, says, we agree. It would make far more sense for industry and communities and opponents to come together and develop these kinds of approaches than it would to put that animal on the Endangered Species Act. Because to put that animal on the Endangered Species Act means that that animal is now tucked away, very hard to get at. But at the same time, all of these issues surrounding it now are on hold for however long it may take for those circumstances to change. Great concern recently about whether the sage grouse will be listed and have drastic implications for the oil and gas industry in the United States of America. The decision has just come out where they are not going to list the bird because the process they have in place to secure its conservation is better than anything that would come under the Endangered Species Act. Now, it took 25 years for us to figure out that there could be a better way of people just cooperating than relying on some regulation to solve the problem for them, but thankfully, it eventually happened. Now, I know right here, and in Newfoundland, and in other parts of Canada right now, the Migratory Bird and Convention Act has raised its head with respect to what can and cannot be done at certain times of the year, namely the breeding season of neotropical migrants. This is an issue. We have a 100-year-old and more contract between our countries to say how we are going to deal with these beasts. Does that mean that we are incapable of sitting down together to try to find a more innovative way to deal with that issue than to simply say the regulation is there and therefore we can do nothing? We've seen constitutions of countries change, let alone specific aspects of specific acts. What holds us back from these things is fear. Fear of coming together to try to innovate and make change that would be better for all of us. I don't know what that solution is in that particular case. But I can tell you right now, if the solution is simply, there it is, it can never be discussed, it can never be opened up, there's nothing we can ever do, then all of us in this room know what the implications are. This leads me to the next point of something that we should be striving for. We should be pursuing bottom-up approaches to these issues and not top-down ones. If we are going to allow this world of conservation and the development of natural resources to be decided by government regulations that become more and more complex, more and more layered over time, more and more impossible to penetrate with anything like the normal human mind in terms of seeking comprehension, then we will live in a world where everyone is dissatisfied and held in traction. The political elites don't want that role. I can tell you, I've been as close to politics in Newfoundland as many people who've been in office. Political elites do not want that role. Some of the bureaucracy may cherish it sometimes, I don't know. But I can guarantee you, industry does not want that to be the way it works. And most people in the public, if they knew the circumstances, wouldn't want it either. Now, how are we going to get to bottom-up kinds of processes versus top-down kinds of processes? We're only going to do it if the bright people in this room who have individual businesses decide to come together to try to make proposals that make good sense, like they've done with the Endangered Species Act in the United States. No one in the room can tell me it's not possible because I see it playing out all over the world now. Let us not be the last to ride this horse. We need, of course, to stay with our investments in science and empirical knowledge, but more importantly, we need to figure out how to mobilize that information so it does the right thing for people and the right thing for industry, and we need to mobilize it quickly. We need to be thinking about the mobilization of that information before we even start the scientific investigations. That should be part of the protocol of development. And if you think that's always the case, my blessings upon you. It's not. As a matter of fact, it's very often not the case. Then we end up with a pile of information, and then we got to suddenly figure out what do we do with it. And then everybody interprets it differently, and so no one really knows what to do with it anyway. Industry checks all the boxes and say we do this, that, and the other thing, but somebody else has a new interpretation and says that's not good enough. These are the ways things are playing out, ladies and gentlemen, in many parts of the world. We should also realize that while we want science, there will be decisions that political leaders will have to make in the absence of good data. It would be wonderful if all of the governments in Newfoundland or all the governments in British Columbia, for all the generations that we have had them, could simply have always sat down with perfect data to make perfect decisions about complex issues. Now, I ask you in your businesses, how many times does that happen to you? And how long does it take you to get there to get that kind of information where you can make those kinds of decisions? You got to be thinking a long way ahead to get to that point. Well, unfortunately for us, the chaotic, stampeding world of politics means that very often that is not always there. Yet crises emerge and decisions have to be made. That is a reality we cannot escape from, but is one we should learn a great deal more about. And we should realize that there is a new world order out there. Young Chinese are feeling vastly different about wildlife than their parents and their grandparents. And they will launch upon the world a wave, because of the numbers of them, of new thinking that will have drastic implications for businesses the world over. I choose them only as an example. This is happening in India. It is happening in South Korea. It is happening in Canada and the United States. And no matter how powerful the political force or the industrial might, neither of them are powerful to override for very long the social debate that will ultimately determine the social license for operation. There is, in democracies and even in non-democracies, incredible power in either the satisfaction or the dissatisfaction of people. One of the other things we should do, ladies and gentlemen, in trying to achieve this balance is we should learn from the achievements of others who have already done great things so we don't have to repeat them, and also find the mistakes that others have made and analyze them so we don't do that either. And there's not one business in this room that cannot do those kinds of things to one extent or another. The IUCN, United Nations, in 1987, some of you will remember this, came out with what was known as the Brundtland Commission, which was going to be the new blueprint for how the world would develop resources and how we would all approach this coming rise in human populations and so on and so forth. What was absent from the Brundtland Commission was a recognition that the idea of conservation existed in Canada and the United States for 100 years before their book was written, and that what the interpretation of conservation in Canada and the United States was historically, as identified by Sir Wilfrid Laurier and Theodore Roosevelt and the rest of those giants who were around them at the time, was called wise use. It was not called preservation. It was not called anything other than wise use of resources. Now, we may not always have been wise in our use of resources, ladies and gentlemen, but we have had a template which has seen a massive increase in the human populations in Canada and the United States, a massive increase in the firepower and the industrial development and the activities in both our countries, great new diversity in the makeup of our societies, and yet you still live in a pretty good place. By any standard in the world, you still have an extraordinary place to call home. Wildlife is still abundant in Canada and the United States. There are exceptions. There are problems in specific places with specific species, it is true. But overall, our approach has not been a failure. The United Nations came out with its ideas in '87 and said the world should set aside 12% of all area as preserved or protected areas, and many countries have followed suit. In 2007, we came out with a new report, and that report focused on market-based approaches to nature conservation. We saw great evidence that market forces could be a huge complement to non-market forces in helping preserve ecosystems and ecosystem services. And we made that available to the world to demonstrate that some recalibration was needed so that the world does not have the notion that industry has no interest in the natural world or has any less interest in the natural world than anyone else. There are decisions made one way or the other about others all the time. But I think we all recall that if we degrade the natural systems of this world and the services they provide, the food, the fiber, the water, the clean air, it's not just simply bad business, it's bad public policy. And so neither the political elites in this room nor the industrial leaders in this room should really have any desire or tendency to create bad business or bad public policy. So where does this lead us? When I was asked to speak here, I was quite excited. And the reason I was quite excited was because I'm always looking for examples of where the future is headed. That's what I do. I advise organizations, institutions, and governments in some cases where I think sustainable use, livelihoods of people, the status of natural resources, issues such as hunting and extraction, where they're headed. That's what I do. And I see British Columbia as this place that's like a great petri dish that we're going to study You have the extraordinary diversity, both biologically and economically. You have diversities of cultures. You have an extraordinary diversity of First Nations. You have tremendous opportunities for resource extraction, industries that provide billions of dollars every year to the economy of this province and give it the infrastructure and the quality of life that it has in many instances. But you're also struggling because some things change. Oil is not where it is. Commodity prices are not where they were. The attitudes towards the harvest of wildlife are not where they were. All of these things are changing. But somehow, you've got to make decisions about them all. One of the things that we learned from the collapse of the Northern Cod was that an entire culture could be set off course, could stumble. The oldest non-native culture in North America, Newfoundland, could stumble badly by one fatal issue around resource extraction. The stakes are high. We also learned, however, because now, 30 years later almost, 30 years, we see the first real signs that those fish are coming back. The interesting thing, ladies and gentlemen, is this. Many Newfoundland fishermen are not all that keen on the cod coming back, because all the species that the cod used to eat bloomed in the absence of the cod, the crab and the shrimp, the species that pay more. So now this is a cultural dilemma. Do we want to see the return of this great thing that fed us for 3.5, almost 4 centuries? Or do we want a different natural system out there? These are the unpredictable consequences that occur when natural resources are extracted at a pace that is too fast for the natural system to respond. But we sit here in our wealth and in our freedom. I travel the world and I see a great deal of misery, a great deal of hardship. I see countries where there are no institutions at all to guide these issues. There are no good governments. There's no rule of law. There are no NGOs fighting for one position or another, no organized community groups who have a position on this, that, or the other thing. I see people who have very little, people who will never have anything but very little unless they come here. Now maybe that's not your responsibility. Maybe it's not mine either. But I feel like it is. Because I feel that if we, in our rich systems where we have so much, cannot simply figure out how to find this balance for economies, the environment, culture, and ultimately for people, then I can see absolutely no hope for the rest of the world. In my career, I did work with BP Selco, with Abitibi Price Incorporated, with Newfoundland and Labrador Hydro, and with many other industries. And hardly any of that work was ever done under the duress of government order. For 13 years, I studied the effects of timber harvesting on woodland caribou on the island of Newfoundland with funding from a forest company, Abitibi Price, that came as a result of my, at 22 years of age, walking into the woodlands manager's office. His name was Ron McKelvey. Great, big, robust Ron McKelvey, tough as nails. And I said, Mr. McKelvey, I'm Shane Mahoney, and I don't know what's happening when the caribou go in the timber, but my radio collars, these were brand spanking new things now, no one had them before then. That's where they're living. And he said, well, I guess we should try to figure it out. I said, yes, sir, we should. We started a study that ran for 13 years. In addition to the money that that company gave, they built us lodgings, they repaired the flats in our vehicles, they cooked all of our meals. And the neatest thing for us at that age, because we could eat until, the cows came home, these wood camps had these beautiful walk-in freezers. And there was everything there, from big cheeses to big bolognas, big everything. And we'd come in there in the evening after coming off that country, and we'd eat our dinner. But then about 2 hours later, we'd hit these big freezers. Well, we never lived so well in our lives, I can tell. It was in those woods camps. In the end, we published all that data. There was no restriction by that company. Some of the information said that there was very little effect. Some information said that at certain times on females with calves there was. There was no fighting. There was no dissension. And it taught me very early that better ways are possible. I then went on to do the same thing with a major mining consortium and the same thing with a hydroelectric energy development corporation. I'm not saying this for any other reason than to explain to the government officials that are here and to the industry officials that are here that it is possible to do it in a really voluntary way. And in my view, it's the only way this world is going to succeed. I am not naive. Businesses need profit. To employ people means that there must be enough money to do so. I realize all of that. But I can tell you that in this 21st century, the industries that will be seen as the leading industries in the world will be those who, beyond the call of any government regulation, decide to try, at whatever small scale, in whatever way they choose, to do something that's right for both their business and the environment in which they operate. I know this is possible. I know it is possible. And I encourage you to pursue this, because if it can be done in the complicated world of British Columbia, then we can take those ideas and we can transfer them to other parts of the world. We have one natural world, ladies and gentlemen. We have one humanity, and we have one chance. And the responsibility is divided equally. It's divided now into 7.2 billion parts. One little morsel for every human being on the planet. And if I can ever help any of you through my work with the IUCN in helping you achieve this, please let me know. When we have the giant corporations like Rio Tinto and others joining that organization simply to get advice, it has some value. It can benefit you, and it benefits that organization when groups like you come to it to share your experiences. You should make British Columbia the model that everyone else works towards. You should do that for yourselves, for your children, for your province, for this country, and for this world. And wouldn't it be great if we could borrow the wisdom of older peoples than ourselves and consider what will be left 7 generations from now? There's not one thing that human beings cannot achieve. Thank you all very much.